The twin rotors of the massive Chinook helicopter beat a rhythm that sounded like thunder rolling across the Colorado mountains. To most pilots at Fort Carson, it was the sound of obsolescence, a relic from an era when brute force mattered more than precision technology. But to Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Mitchell, it was the heartbeat of survival itself. In 12 hours, that same aircraft they mockingly called a flying coffin would carry 40 souls through conditions that would ground every other helicopter on the base. The rescue would become legendary, not because it was impossible, but because everyone had assumed it was. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of how the most underestimated pilot and the most dismissed aircraft prove that sometimes the old ways don't just work, they're the only thing that works when everything else fails. Dawn broke over Fort Carson with the crisp clarity that only comes at 7,000 feet above sea level. The Colorado air was thin enough to challenge engines and thick enough with tension to cut. Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Mitchell walked the perimeter of her aircraft with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that details meant the difference between coming home and becoming a statistic. Her Chinook, tail number 47 Charlie, sat like a sleeping giant among the sleek attack helicopters and modern transport birds that dominated the flight line. Where the newer aircraft gleamed with fresh paint and pristine maintenance, Charlie bore the honest scars of 2 decades of service. Patches welded over bullet holes from Afghanistan, paint worn thin by desert sand and mountain snow, and hydraulic stains that told stories of missions completed despite mechanical protests. The CH-47 Chinook was never meant to be beautiful, with its twin rotors spinning in opposite directions, and its bulbous cargo bay that could swallow a small truck. It looked more like a mechanical whale than a graceful bird of prey. But Sarah knew what others had forgotten. Beauty was irrelevant when lives hung in the balance. She ran her hand along a section of aluminum where shrapnel had left its mark during a medical evacuation in Kandahar 3 years earlier. The repair was solid, stronger than the original metal, but it drew the eye like a scar on an otherwise unmarked face. The newer pilot saw weakness where Sarah saw resilience. "Still talking to that museum piece, Mitchell?" The voice belonged to Major Kevin Brooks, the squadron's executive officer and Sarah's most vocal critic. He approached with the confident stride of someone who had never questioned his own assumptions. Behind him followed his usual entourage, Captain Derek Walsh and Lieutenant Marcus Chen, both pilots of the squadron's newest aircraft and both eager to impress their superior with the right kind of laughter at the right moments. Sarah straightened but didn't salute. They were on the flight line, not in the formal confines of the command post. "Running pre-flight inspection, sir, same as always." Brooks circled the Chinook like a predator studying wounded prey. "You know, the Army's been trying to retire these things for years. There's a reason the newer birds have computer-assisted flight controls and digital maintenance tracking. This analog approach went out with the Cold War." "Analog doesn't fail when the computers crash," Sarah replied evenly. "And this bird has completed more successful missions than any 3 aircraft on this base combined." Captain Walsh snorted, loud enough to ensure everyone heard. "Successful missions or lucky breaks? There's a difference between skill and just not getting shot down yet." Sarah felt the familiar heat rise in her chest but kept her voice level. She'd had this conversation too many times to let emotion drive her response. "The maintenance logs are public record, Captain. Feel free to compare operational readiness rates whenever you'd like." It was true, and everyone knew it. While the newer aircraft spent weeks in maintenance for every computer glitch and software update, Charlie rarely stayed grounded for more than a day. The older systems were robust, repairable in the field, and designed by engineers who understood that helicopters would be shot at, stressed beyond design limits, and operated in conditions that would destroy delicate electronics. Lieutenant Chen, eager to prove his loyalty to the Major's perspective, gestured dismissively at the aircraft. "Sure, it runs, but what about capability? Our birds have terrain-following radar, integrated communications suites, and defensive countermeasures. That thing is basically a flying truck with guns bolted on." Sarah allowed herself a thin smile. "You're right, Lieutenant. It is basically a flying truck. A flying truck that can carry twice the payload of your advanced aircraft, land in spaces where your computers would refuse to take you, and keep flying when battle damage would ground anything with a circuit board." The comment hit closer to home than any of them wanted to admit. Just last month, Walsh's helicopter had been grounded for 2 weeks, because a software update had corrupted the flight control system. The manufacturer's technicians had flown in from Connecticut to reinstall programs that should have been bulletproof. Major Brooks stepped closer, his voice dropping to the tone he used when he wanted to ensure his displeasure was understood without witnesses overhearing. "Mitchell, your attitude problem is becoming a readiness problem. Maybe it's time you considered that there's a reason the Army invests in modern equipment instead of keeping antiques flying out of nostalgia." "Sir, with respect, this isn't about nostalgia, it's about mission effectiveness. When the Apaches can't lift enough wounded and the Blackhawks can't handle the altitude, Charlie gets the call, every time." Brooks's face flushed red. He'd been at Fort Carson for 8 months, long enough to know that Sarah's statement was factually accurate, but not long enough to appreciate why that mattered more than his preferences for newer technology. "What I see is a pilot who's too stubborn to adapt to modern warfare. The battlefield has evolved, Mitchell. Maybe you should too." Sarah looked past the Major toward the mountains that ringed the base. Somewhere beyond those peaks, soldiers were training for missions that would test every piece of equipment they carried. When the real tests came, and they always came, computers and software wouldn't matter as much as the bond between pilot and machine that could only be forged through experience. "Sir, the battlefield has evolved, but physics hasn't. Gravity doesn't care about software versions, and mountain weather doesn't check compatibility with computer systems before it tries to kill you." The honesty of the statement hung in the morning air like a challenge. Walsh and Chen exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh or take offense. Brooks stared at Sarah with the expression of a man who had just been told that his expensive watch was less reliable than sundial. "We'll see about that, Mitchell. Command is evaluating all aircraft assignments for the upcoming training exercises. Don't be surprised if Charlie finds herself in a support role while the real pilots handle the primary missions." With that, Brooks turned and walked away, his followers trailing behind like ducklings. Sarah watched them go, noting how they moved with the confidence of people who had never been tested by genuine adversity. They flew aircraft that cost millions of dollars and required climate-controlled hangars. They had never learned the lesson that her grandfather had tried to teach her father, and that her father had successfully passed on to her. The most sophisticated machine in the world was worthless, without the skill to use it when everything went wrong. Sarah's father, Colonel James Mitchell, had flown Chinooks in Vietnam when they were new technology. He'd brought home stories of aircraft that kept flying with holes you could put your fist through, of pilots who had learned to read the sky like a language, and of missions where the only thing standing between success and catastrophe was the relationship between human intuition and mechanical reliability. Those stories had shaped Sarah's understanding of what it meant to be a pilot. Not someone who managed computer systems, but someone who could coax performance from metal and engines through understanding that went beyond technical specifications. The newer pilots were technicians. Sarah was something rarer, a craftsman. She resumed her inspection of Charlie, checking oil levels and hydraulic pressure with instruments that had remained unchanged for decades. The gauges told her everything she needed to know without requiring interpretation by computer algorithms. When something was wrong, she could feel it through the controls, hear it in the engine note, or see it in the response of the aircraft to her inputs. The radio in her flight suit crackled to life. "Mitchell, report to the operations center. Colonel Martinez wants to see you." Sarah keyed her mic. "On my way." As she walked toward the operations building, she couldn't shake the feeling that Major Brooks's threat had been more than idle posturing. The Army was under constant pressure to modernize, to prove that every dollar spent on new technology was justified by improved performance. Aircraft like Charlie represented uncomfortable questions about whether newer was always better. But Sarah also knew something that the spreadsheet analysts and technology advocates often forgot. In combat, soldiers didn't care about the sophistication of their rescue aircraft. They cared about whether it would come for them when everything else had failed. Charlie had never failed to come home, and more importantly, had never failed to bring everyone else home too. The morning sun climbed higher over the Colorado peaks, casting long shadows across the flight line. In a few hours, those same mountains would test every assumption about modern versus proven, new versus reliable. The test would come sooner than anyone expected. and it would reveal truths that no amount of computer modeling could predict. For now, though, Charlie sat waiting on the tarmac, ready for whatever mission would come next. The flying coffin, as her critics called her, was about to become something very different indeed. Colonel Elena Martinez commanded the 4th Combat Aviation Brigade with the sharp efficiency of someone who had earned her position through combat leadership rather than political maneuvering. Her office walls displayed commendations from 3 different theaters of operation, but more telling were the photos of aircraft and crews she had commanded, pictures that showed the human cost of decisions made in sterile briefing rooms. Sarah stood at attention before the colonel's desk, studying the woman who would decide her immediate future. Martinez was reviewing a file that Sarah recognized as her own service record, though she couldn't tell from the colonel's expression whether the contents were viewed favorably or with concern. "Sit down, Mitchell." Martinez closed the file and leaned back in her chair. "Major Brooks has made some interesting recommendations regarding aircraft assignments for the upcoming Mountain Thunder exercise." Sarah settled into the chair, but maintained her military bearing. Mountain Thunder was the largest joint training operation conducted at Fort Carson, involving multiple branches of the military and testing everything from individual soldier skills to large-scale logistics coordination. Assignment to primary missions during Mountain Thunder could define a pilot's career trajectory. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He's recommended that your aircraft be assigned to supply runs and personnel transport, while the newer Chinooks handle the high-priority insertions and extractions. Martinez's voice carried no judgment, but Sarah could sense the colonel was measuring her reaction. "I see, ma'am. May I ask what criteria were used for these recommendations?" Martinez opened the file again, scanning pages filled with performance metrics and evaluation reports. According to Major Brooks, aircraft age and technological capabilities were primary factors. He argues that modern mission requirements demand modern solutions. The phrase sounded rehearsed, like something Brooks had practiced for this exact conversation. Sarah knew that behind the bureaucratic language lay a simple truth. Brooks wanted his favorite pilots flying the missions that would generate the most favorable attention from higher command. "Ma'am, if I may, what do the actual performance statistics show?" Martinez smiled for the first time since Sarah had entered the office. "I was hoping you'd ask that question." She pulled out a different set of documents, these bearing the official seals of maintenance divisions and operational assessment teams. "Over the past 18 months, your aircraft has maintained a 97% mission success rate. The squadron average for newer aircraft is 89%. The numbers didn't surprise Sarah, but hearing them spoken aloud by the colonel carried weight that mere personal knowledge couldn't match. Charlie's reliability wasn't just her opinion. It was a documented fact. "The disparity becomes more interesting when we look at mission complexity," Martinez continued. "Your aircraft has been assigned a disproportionate number of high-risk extractions, mountain rescues, and missions in adverse weather conditions. Yet the success rate remains higher than aircraft operating in optimal conditions." Sarah remained silent, knowing that anything she said now would sound like bragging rather than professional assessment. "However," Martinez's tone shifted slightly, "Major Brooks raises valid points about the importance of technological integration in modern warfare. Your aircraft lacks several systems that are considered standard in contemporary operations." This was the heart of the matter, Sarah realized. Not whether Charlie could complete missions, but whether the missions she completed were the right kind of missions for career advancement and bureaucratic approval. "Ma'am, may I speak freely?" "Please do." Sarah chose her words carefully, knowing that this conversation would likely determine not just her role in Mountain Thunder, but her entire future in the unit. "Colonel, I understand the appeal of newer technology. Advanced systems can provide capabilities that older aircraft lack, but mission success ultimately depends on the interaction between pilot, machine, and circumstances. Some of us have learned to maximize that interaction with equipment that responds predictably under stress." Martinez nodded slowly. "Explain what you mean by responds predictably." "Modern aircraft rely heavily on computer-assisted systems that work perfectly under normal conditions, but when those systems encounter situations they weren't programmed to handle, extreme weather, battle damage, or mechanical stress beyond design parameters, they can fail catastrophically. Older systems like Charlie's are more forgiving. They degrade gracefully rather than failing completely. The colonel made a note in Sarah's file. Major Brooks argues that properly trained pilots should be able to handle any situation using modern equipment. Sarah felt herself walking into dangerous territory. Criticizing Brooks directly would be insubordinate, but failing to defend her position would be dishonest. Ma'am, training can only simulate so many variables. Real-world conditions often exceed the parameters that training scenarios can replicate. When that happens, experience with equipment that operates reliably across a wider range of conditions becomes invaluable. Martinez closed the file and stood, walking to the window that overlooked the flight line. Sarah could see Charlie in the distance, looking exactly like what she was, a workhorse built for function rather than impressiveness. Mitchell, I'm going to be direct with you. The Army is under enormous pressure to justify its equipment expenditures. Every old aircraft that continues to outperform newer ones raises questions that some people would prefer not to answer. The admission hung in the air between them. Sarah understood now that this wasn't just about mission assignments or personal prejudices. It was about institutional politics that extended far beyond Fort Carson. That said, Martinez continued, my job is to ensure mission success, not to make procurement officers comfortable. I'm assigning you to Team Alpha for Mountain Thunder. Sarah felt a surge of relief, quickly followed by wariness. Team Alpha handled the most challenging aspects of the exercise, including high-altitude rescues and insertion of special operations personnel. It was exactly the kind of assignment that would showcase her abilities, or provide ammunition for her critics if anything went wrong. Thank you, ma'am. What's the specific mission profile? Martinez returned to her desk and pulled out a classified briefing folder. High-altitude personnel recovery in the Sangre de Cristo range. Simulated crash site at 11,000 feet with multiple casualties requiring immediate evacuation. Weather conditions will be marginal at best. The mission parameters made Sarah's heart rate increase slightly. 11,000 feet was near the operational ceiling for many aircraft, and marginal weather conditions in the Colorado mountains could deteriorate from challenging to impossible with little warning. The newer Chinooks will be handling the primary insertion phase, Martinez continued. Your job is to prove that when everything goes wrong, there's still a way to get the job done. Sarah understood the subtext. This wasn't just a training mission, it was a test. If she succeeded, she would validate the continued use of older aircraft and the pilots who flew them. If she failed, Brooks would have all the justification he needed to ground Charlie permanently. Ma'am, I'll need detailed topographical maps of the recovery site and current weather projections. Already prepared. Martinez handed her a thick envelope. Mitchell, I need you to understand something. This assignment isn't just about proving your aircraft's capabilities. It's about proving that institutional knowledge and experience have value that can't be replaced by newer technology. Sarah accepted the envelope, feeling the weight of more than just paper and photographs. I understand, ma'am. As she left the colonel's office, Sarah's mind was already working through the challenges ahead. High-altitude flying in mountain conditions was always dangerous, but it was exactly the kind of mission where Charlie's robust design and her own experience would provide advantages that computer systems couldn't match. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of mission planning and equipment preparation. Sarah spread the topographical maps across a table in the flight planning room, studying elevation contours and identifying potential hazards that wouldn't be visible from satellite imagery. The recovery site was located in a narrow valley surrounded by peaks that would create unpredictable wind patterns and limit approach options. Master Sergeant David Kim, Charlie's flight engineer, joined her at the planning table. Kim had been working on Chinooks for 15 years and understood the aircraft's capabilities as well as anyone in the Army. More importantly, he shared Sarah's philosophy that reliable equipment properly used would outperform sophisticated equipment improperly understood. This is going to be interesting, Kim said, studying the terrain maps. That valley will be a wind tunnel in anything more than light air. Sarah nodded. Which is exactly why they're not sending the newer birds. Their flight computers will refuse to maintain stable hover in those conditions. What about us? Sarah ran her finger along the contour lines, identifying a spot where the terrain might provide some wind protection. We'll do what we always do, read the air and adapt in real time. Kim grinned. Just like the old days. The phrase reminded Sarah that she and Kim represented something that was becoming increasingly rare in the modern military. specialists who had learned their craft through experience rather than simulation. They had flown together in Afghanistan, where computer models meant nothing and survival depended on understanding the relationship between aircraft performance and environmental conditions. Their planning session was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Walsh, who entered the room with the confident stride of someone who expected to be welcomed. Behind him came Lieutenant Chen, both carrying their own mission folders. "Mitchell," Walsh said, settling into a chair without invitation. "Heard you got assigned to the cleanup mission." Sarah kept her voice neutral. "Alpha Team, insertion and recovery. What's your assignment?" "Primary insertion. We'll be delivering the special ops teams to the initial staging areas." Walsh opened his folder, revealing photographs of the same mountain terrain Sarah had been studying. "Should be straightforward: computer-assisted navigation, GPS-guided approach, and automated hover systems. The newer birds are perfect for precision work like this." Lieutenant Chen nodded eagerly. "The flight management systems can compensate for wind conditions automatically. Takes all the guesswork out of mountain flying." Master Sergeant Kim looked up from the maps with an expression of polite skepticism. "What happens if the GPS signal gets blocked by the terrain? Mountain valleys can create dead zones." Walsh waved dismissively. "The systems have backup navigation modes. Inertial guidance, terrain correlation, multiple redundancies. That's the advantage of modern technology. You don't have to rely on seat-of-the-pants flying." Sarah exchanged a glance with Kim. Both had experienced situations where electronic navigation systems had failed, leaving pilots dependent on fundamental flying skills in aircraft that responded predictably to manual control inputs. "Besides," Chen added, clearly eager to demonstrate his technical knowledge, "the mission planners have calculated optimal approach routes using computer modeling. We just follow the programmed flight path and let the aircraft handle the details." The comment revealed a fundamental difference in philosophy that went beyond personal preference. Walsh and Chen viewed flying as a technical problem to be solved through superior equipment and automated systems. Sarah saw it as a dynamic interaction between human judgment and mechanical capability that required constant adaptation. "What's your backup plan if the automated systems encounter conditions outside their programming parameters?" Kim asked. Walsh's confidence didn't waver. "That's not going to happen. The mission planners have accounted for all foreseeable variables." Sarah bit her tongue to avoid pointing out that the most dangerous variables were often the ones that couldn't be foreseen. Instead, she returned her attention to the topographical maps, noting features that might provide options if the original plan encountered problems. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Walsh and Chen describing their aircraft's capabilities in terms that sounded more like software demonstrations than flight operations. Sarah listened politely, but her focus remained on the terrain features and weather patterns that would actually determine mission success or failure. When the two pilots finally left, Kim shook his head with amusement. "They talk about flying like it's a video game." "Maybe that's how they learned," Sarah replied. "Flight simulators and computer programs instead of actual aircraft that fight back when you push them too hard." Kim nodded. "Different world, different priorities." Sarah folded the maps and gathered her planning materials. Tomorrow would reveal whether modern technology or experienced judgment would prove more valuable when the mountains tested both approaches. The institutional pressure to favor newer equipment was understandable, but physics and weather wouldn't care about procurement policies or career advancement. As she walked back toward the flight line, Sarah passed the newer Chinooks that Walsh and Chen would be flying. They looked impressive. Fresh paint, updated avionics, and modifications that spoke of millions of dollars in research and development. But they also looked untested, like machines that had never been pushed beyond their design specifications. Charlie sat nearby, bearing her scars like medals earned through service. Tomorrow would add new stresses to systems that had already proven their reliability under extreme conditions. The test wasn't just about completing a mission, it was about validating an approach to flying that valued adaptability over automation. The prejudice was building toward a confrontation that would settle more than just aircraft assignments. It would determine whether the Army's future would be built on technological superiority or operational wisdom. Sarah intended to prove that the best choice might be finding ways to honor both. The meteorological briefing room at Fort Carson buzzed with the controlled energy of mission preparation. 47 personnel from various units filled the tiered seating, their faces reflecting the mixture of anticipation and professional focus that preceded major training exercises. Sarah sat in the middle section, her notebook open and pen ready, while the newer pilots clustered near the front where they could demonstrate their engagement to the senior officers present. Chief Meteorologist Dr. Amanda Foster stepped to the podium with the bearing of someone who had learned to deliver complex information to audiences more interested in what they wanted to hear than what they needed to know. Her Weather Service uniform bore ribbons indicating deployment to multiple theaters, suggesting experience that went beyond academic training. Ladies and gentlemen, the weather picture for Mountain Thunder is developing into something significantly more challenging than our initial projections indicated. Dr. Foster's opening statement caused a ripple of attention throughout the room. Behind her, the large display screen showed satellite imagery of a massive low-pressure system approaching from the Pacific Northwest. Sarah studied the swirling cloud formations with growing concern. The system looked larger and more organized than typical Colorado mountain weather, with a structure that suggested it would bring sustained high winds rather than the usual brief afternoon thunderstorms. Current surface winds are light and variable, but upper-level analysis shows a strong jet stream diving southward. By 0800 hours tomorrow, we expect sustained winds of 35 to 50 knots at mountain peak levels, with gusts potentially exceeding 70 knots. Major Brooks shifted in his front row seat, clearly uncomfortable with projections that might affect his carefully planned mission timeline. Dr. Foster, what's the confidence level on these forecasts? Mountain weather can change rapidly. Dr. Foster nodded professionally, but her expression remained serious. Sir, the confidence level is high. Multiple weather models are showing consistent results, and the atmospheric dynamics are well defined. This system has characteristics similar to the storm that grounded all aviation operations for 3 days last November. Sarah remembered that storm vividly. She had been assigned weather duty and had watched aircraft after aircraft attempt to launch only to return immediately when they encountered conditions that exceeded their operational parameters. Only the most experienced pilots in the most robust aircraft had been able to maintain any kind of flying schedule. Captain Walsh raised his hand. Ma'am, our newer aircraft have advanced weather radar and automated turbulence compensation. Are these wind forecasts based on assumptions about older aircraft capabilities? The question revealed Walsh's fundamental misunderstanding of how weather affected aviation, but Dr. Foster answered with patient professionalism. Captain, wind speeds of 50 to 70 knots affect all aircraft equally, regardless of their avionics. The issue isn't detection or compensation. It's the basic physics of rotor disk loading and control authority. Lieutenant Chen joined the discussion, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never been humbled by actual experience. But our flight management systems can automatically adjust for wind conditions. The computers react faster than human pilots. Dr. Foster pulled up a new chart showing wind shear patterns predicted for the mountain valleys. The challenge isn't reaction time, Lieutenant. It's the fact that in mountain terrain, wind conditions can change from 20 knots to 60 knots, over distances measured in hundreds of feet. No computer system can anticipate sudden shifts that violate the basic assumptions programmed into their algorithms. Sarah felt compelled to add her perspective. Dr. Foster, based on these wind patterns, what's your assessment of operational feasibility for high-altitude missions? The meteorologist's expression grew more serious. Chief Mitchell, I would classify high-altitude operations as extremely hazardous. The combination of altitude effects on aircraft performance and severe wind conditions creates a situation where margins for error become very small. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Mountain Thunder was built around high-altitude operations, and declaring them extremely hazardous called into question the entire exercise timeline. Major Brooks stood abruptly, his face flushed with the kind of anger that comes from having carefully laid plans disrupted by inconvenient facts. Dr. Foster, with respect, weather forecasts are predictions, not certainties. Military operations require accepting calculated risks. Sir, I understand the operational pressures, but my responsibility is to provide accurate meteorological assessment. These conditions represent significant hazards for any aircraft, but particularly for complex missions requiring precision flying. Brooks turned to address the room, his voice carrying the authority of rank and the impatience of someone accustomed to having obstacles removed rather than acknowledged. Ladies and gentlemen, we've trained for months for this exercise. Weather has always been a factor in military operations. The question isn't whether conditions will be perfect. It's whether we're prepared to accomplish our missions despite challenges. The speech drew murmurs of approval from several junior officers. But Sarah noticed that the more experienced pilots remained silent. They had learned through hard experience that bravado was a poor substitute for careful risk assessment. Dr. Foster maintained her professional composure but pressed her point. "Major, I'm not recommending mission cancellation based on minor weather concerns. The atmospheric conditions developing are genuinely dangerous. Peak wind speeds could exceed the design limitations of several aircraft types." Sarah raised her hand again. "Dr. Foster, can you break down the specific risks by altitude and terrain type?" The meteorologist switched to a new display showing cross-sectional wind analysis of the mountain ranges surrounding Fort Carson. At altitudes above 10,000 feet, the combination of terrain-induced turbulence and high-velocity wind streams will create severe mechanical stress on rotorcraft. Additionally, the density-altitude effects will reduce engine performance just when maximum power is needed to maintain control. Master Sergeant Kim, who had been taking detailed notes throughout the briefing, looked up with a frown. "Ma'am, what about the recovery site at 11,000 feet? That puts it right in the worst wind zone." "Exactly, Sergeant. That location will experience the most severe conditions during the storm's peak intensity." Brooks interrupted with visible irritation. "The mission planners selected that site specifically because it represents realistic operational challenges. If we can't train in difficult conditions, how can we expect to perform in combat?" The comment drew nods from Walsh and Chen, but Sarah noticed that Colonel Martinez, who had been listening quietly from the back of the room, wore an expression of thoughtful concern. Dr. Foster pulled up historical weather data. "Major, I need to emphasize that these aren't just, quote, difficult conditions. The wind speeds we're forecasting have historically resulted in aircraft accidents. Last year, a similar weather pattern caused 2 helicopter crashes in similar terrain in Colorado Springs." The mention of actual crashes shifted the room's atmosphere. Training exercises were meant to simulate danger, not created through unnecessary risk-taking. Sarah felt obligated to voice her growing concerns. "Dr. Foster, based on your analysis, what would be the safest approach for aircraft operations during this weather window?" "Ideally, postponement until the system passes. If operations must continue, limiting flights to lower altitudes with maximum safety margins, using only aircraft and crews with extensive mountain weather experience, and maintaining constant communication with meteorological monitoring stations." Brooks's patience finally snapped. "Dr. Foster, thank you for the briefing, but operational decisions are made by operational commanders, not weather officers. We've all heard the risks. Now we need to focus on mission execution." The dismissal was professionally delivered, but carried unmistakable finality. Dr. Foster gathered her materials with the resigned expression of someone who had delivered warnings that would be ignored for reasons having nothing to do with meteorology. As the briefing broke up, Sarah approached the meteorologist near the podium. "Dr. Foster, off the record, how bad do you expect this to get?" The weather officer looked around to ensure their conversation wouldn't be overheard. "Chief Mitchell, I've been forecasting mountain weather for 12 years. I have never seen atmospheric conditions that combined this many hazardous factors simultaneously. If I were making the operational decisions, I would ground all aircraft until this system passes." "How long until it passes?" "Best case, 18 hours. More likely 24 to 36 hours. Sarah thanked the meteorologist and walked toward the exit, her mind processing the implications. The timing meant that Mountain Thunder would proceed directly into the worst possible weather conditions, with mission planners who seemed more concerned about schedule adherence than crew safety. In the hallway outside the briefing room, she encountered Captain Walsh and Lieutenant Chen discussing the weather projections with the casual confidence of pilots who had never been genuinely tested. "The computers can handle wind conditions like that," Walsh was saying. "The flight management systems are designed for exactly these kinds of situations." Chen nodded enthusiastically. "Plus, we'll have real-time weather updates through the data link. If conditions get too rough, we can just abort and return to base." Sarah couldn't resist interjecting. "Captain, have you ever tried to abort a mountain approach in 60-knot winds?" Walsh turned with a slightly condescending smile he reserved for questions he considered naive. "Mitchell, that's exactly why we have automated flight controls. The computer handles the precision work while the pilot manages overall mission parameters." "And what happens when the computer encounters conditions outside its programming?" "That's what the safety margins are for. The system won't let you exceed aircraft limitations. Sarah realized she was talking to pilots who had never learned the fundamental truth that aircraft limitations were often exceeded by circumstances, not choices. "Captain, safety margins assume normal conditions. Mountain weather can create situations where normal limitations become irrelevant very quickly." Chen joined the conversation with youthful confidence. "Chief Mitchell, I understand you're concerned about your older aircraft's capabilities, but modern systems are designed to handle extreme conditions automatically." The comment stung because it revealed how completely Chen missed the point. This wasn't about aircraft age. It was about understanding that sophisticated systems could fail in sophisticated ways when faced with conditions their designers hadn't anticipated. "Lieutenant, sophisticated systems have sophisticated failure modes. Sometimes the simpler approach is more reliable when everything goes wrong simultaneously." Walsh shook his head with amusement. "Mitchell, you sound like my grandfather talking about carburetors being better than fuel injection. Technology advances for good reasons." As the two pilots walked away, still discussing the superiority of their computer-assisted aircraft, Sarah felt the familiar frustration of watching people mistake complexity for capability. Their confidence wasn't based on experience with adverse conditions. It was based on faith in technology that had never been tested under genuine stress. The remainder of the day passed in final mission preparations that seemed increasingly surreal given the weather projections. Flight crews conducted equipment checks, loaded supplies, and reviewed procedures as if the developing storm was a minor inconvenience rather than a potentially lethal hazard. Sarah spent the afternoon with Master Sergeant Kim, conducting the most thorough pre-flight inspection Charlie had received since arriving at Fort Carson. Every system, every component, every backup procedure was verified and double-checked. If they were going to fly in conditions that exceeded normal parameters, the aircraft had to be mechanically perfect. "You know," Kim said while checking hydraulic fluid levels, "in 15 years of flying Chinooks, I've learned that the missions where everything looks perfect are usually the ones where everything goes wrong." Sarah nodded, understanding the paradox. Mountain Thunder had been planned with military precision, backed by advanced technology and detailed computer modeling. But real-world conditions had a way of exposing flaws in even the most carefully constructed plans. As evening approached, Sarah found herself standing on the flight line watching the western sky. The approaching storm was still hours away, but she could already see the high, thin clouds that preceded major weather systems. By morning, those innocent-looking wisps would be replaced by conditions that would test every assumption about modern aviation technology. The warning had been delivered by someone with 12 years of experience in mountain meteorology. It had been ignored by commanders more concerned with maintaining schedules than acknowledging risks. Tomorrow would reveal whether sophisticated equipment and confident pilots could overcome the simple physics of wind, altitude, and mechanical stress. Sarah had seen this pattern before. Institutional momentum carrying operations forward past the point where prudence suggested reconsideration. The results were usually educational for everyone involved, though not always in ways that enhanced career prospects. The storm was coming, indifferent to human plans and technological capabilities. It would test not just aircraft and pilots, but the fundamental assumptions about whether superior equipment could substitute for superior judgment. Sarah suspected the lessons learned would be expensive ones, measured in damaged aircraft and endangered crews. But the decision had been made by people who confused confidence with competence, and now everyone would live with the consequences of warnings ignored. Dawn arrived with deceptive calm at Fort Carson. The wind that would define the day's disasters was still gathering strength in the upper atmosphere, invisible to anyone not trained to read the subtle signs that preceded mountain weather catastrophes. Sarah stood beside Charlie in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the automated weather station's digital readouts with growing unease. Surface winds, 8 knots, variable. Temperature, 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Barometric pressure, falling rapidly. The last measurement told the real story. Pressure was dropping at a rate that indicated the approaching storm system was intensifying faster than Dr. Foster's most pessimistic projections had suggested. But the mission briefings had been completed, flight plans filed, and institutional momentum had reached the point where acknowledging new data would require admitting that yesterday's confident decisions were potentially catastrophic mistakes. Master Sergeant Kim emerged from beneath Charlie's cargo bay, where he had been conducting final inspections of the hydraulic systems that would keep them alive if conditions deteriorated as expected. "All systems show green," he reported. but his tone carried the reservation of someone who understood that perfect mechanical condition meant nothing when weather exceeded operational parameters. "What's your gut telling you about this morning?" Sarah asked, valuing Kim's intuition as much as any instrument reading. Kim wiped his hands on a maintenance rag and looked toward the mountains, where the first hints of unusual cloud formations were becoming visible against the lightening sky. 15 years of flying in these mountains, and I've never seen atmospheric pressure drop this fast without immediate consequences. We're about to get an education in what happens when weather modeling meets reality. At 0600 hours, the operations center came alive with the controlled chaos of major exercise coordination. Radio operators tested communications links, meteorological technicians updated weather displays, and flight coordinators tracked the movement of aircraft that would soon discover whether their confidence was justified or misplaced. Colonel Martinez presided over the activity with the focused attention of someone who understood that training exercises could become real emergencies with alarming speed. She had positioned herself where she could monitor both weather updates and aircraft status, ready to make command decisions that might save lives or careers. "Weather update," called Sergeant Patterson from the meteorological station. "Winds aloft are now showing sustained speeds of 45 knots at 10,000 feet, gusting to 65. The storm system is intensifying ahead of schedule." Martinez frowned at the update, but didn't immediately respond. Changing exercise parameters based on weather updates would require explanations to higher command that no one wanted to provide. The institutional pressure to proceed was enormous, fed by months of preparation and the career implications of publicly acknowledging that conditions were beyond their capabilities. Major Brooks entered the operations center with the purposeful stride of someone determined to project confidence regardless of circumstances. Behind him followed Walsh and Chen, both carrying flight bags and wearing expressions of professional determination mixed with barely concealed excitement. For them, this was the moment to prove that modern technology and superior training could overcome any challenge. "Operation status?" Brooks demanded, scanning the various displays that showed aircraft positions, weather data, and mission timelines. "Primary insertion teams are completing final preparations," reported the operations officer. "Launch sequence begins at 0630 hours." Sarah listened to the exchange while conducting her own pre-flight procedures, noting the absence of any discussion about the rapidly deteriorating weather conditions. The focus remained entirely on maintaining the predetermined schedule, as if atmospheric physics could be managed through administrative discipline. At 0630 hours precisely, the first of the newer Chinooks lifted off from Fort Carson with the smooth efficiency that characterized computer-assisted flight operations. Captain Walsh piloted the lead aircraft. His confidence transmitted clearly through radio communications that described perfect mechanical performance and optimal system functionality. "Alpha lead airborne, all systems nominal. Flight management computer shows green across the board." Lieutenant Chen followed in the second aircraft, his radio calls equally confident. "Alpha 2 departing, automated navigation engaged. GPS lock confirmed, terrain following radar active." Sarah watched the two aircraft disappear into the morning haze, their flight paths programmed by computers that had calculated optimal routes based on weather data that was already 12 hours out of date. The mountain valleys they were entering would teach them lessons about the difference between theoretical and actual flight conditions. 30 minutes later, the first signs of trouble began filtering through radio transmissions that started confident and gradually acquired undertones of concern. "Operations Alpha Lead. Encountering moderate turbulence at angle 8. The flight management system compensates automatically." The transmission sounded routine, but Sarah recognized the subtle tension in Walsh's voice that indicated conditions were more challenging than the official language suggested. Modern pilots were trained to trust their automated systems, but those systems had never been tested in conditions that Dr. Foster had classified as genuinely dangerous. "Hawkins, Alpha 2 is experiencing similar conditions," Chen reported. "Wind speeds are higher than forecast, but navigation systems are maintaining course." Colonel Martinez stepped closer to the radio console, her experience telling her that higher than forecast often meant approaching unmanageable in mountain flying. "Alpha Flight, what are your actual wind readings?" The pause before Walsh's response lasted long enough to suggest he was dealing with conditions that required his full attention. "Operations were showing sustained winds of 40 knots with gusts to 55, significantly higher than mission planning parameters." The admission sent a ripple of concern through the operations center. Mission planning had assumed maximum winds of 30 knots, with occasional gusts to 40. The actual conditions were already exceeding the safety margins built into the flight plans. Alpha Lead, are you able to maintain a mission profile? Major Brooks's voice carried forced calm, but Sarah could detect the underlying anxiety of someone watching carefully laid plans encounter unexpected resistance. Affirmative operations. Flight computers are compensating for wind conditions. We're maintaining course toward the insertion site. But the technology that Walsh trusted was about to encounter conditions that its programmers had never anticipated. Mountain weather didn't respect the elegant algorithms that governed automated flight systems. It created chaotic, unpredictable forces that could overwhelm even the most sophisticated compensation mechanisms. At 0715 hours, the weather took a dramatic turn for the worse. Dr. Foster's worst-case projections proved optimistic as the storm system's leading edge reached the Colorado mountains with unprecedented intensity. Operations Alpha Lead, Walsh's voice cut through the radio chatter with urgency that shattered any pretense of routine flight operations. We're encountering severe wind shear. The flight management system is having difficulty maintaining stable flight. The phrase "having difficulty" was military understatement for conditions that were rapidly approaching the catastrophic. Sarah exchanged glances with Master Sergeant Kim, both understanding that Walsh's automated systems were encountering forces beyond their programming parameters. Alpha 2 declaring emergency. Chen's transmission exploded from the speakers with panic barely controlled by training. Severe downdraft, losing altitude rapidly. Flight controls are not responding normally. The operations center fell silent, except for the hiss of radio static and the sudden increase in activity as emergency protocols activated automatically. Colonel Martinez stepped to the radio console, her voice carrying the authority of someone trained to manage crisis situations. Alpha 2, state your position and altitude. Operations, we're... Jesus Christ! Chen's transmission dissolved into static, followed by a burst of emergency beacons that indicated his aircraft's automated distress systems had activated. Alpha 2, respond! Martinez's voice carried command authority, but radio waves couldn't reach through the mountain chaos that had swallowed Chen's Chinook. Walsh's voice returned, strained but still maintaining some semblance of professional composure. Operations, Alpha Lead has lost contact with Alpha 2. The last visual showed them in an uncontrolled descent toward the valley floor. I'm attempting to reach their position, but wind conditions are beyond flight envelope parameters. The words hung in the operations center like a physical presence. An aircraft was down, crew status unknown, and the remaining helicopter was fighting for survival in conditions that had exceeded every safety calculation. Alpha Lead, what's your current status? Brooks demanded, his earlier confidence replaced by the desperate hope that at least one aircraft could survive the morning's disasters. Operations, I'm fighting to maintain controlled flight. The automated systems keep trying to correct for wind conditions that change faster than the computers can process. I'm having to override the flight management system and fly manually. The admission was devastating for several reasons. Walsh had built his reputation on trust in automated systems, and now he was acknowledging that those systems were not just inadequate but actively dangerous in current conditions. Manual flight in a Chinook during severe mountain turbulence required skills that he had never fully developed. Can you return to base? Martinez asked, though everyone in the operations center understood that retreat might not be possible once aircraft were committed to mountain flying in severe weather. Negative operations. I'm trapped in the valley system. The wind patterns are creating conditions where normal escape routes are blocked. I need immediate assistance or I'm going to join Alpha 2 on the ground. The brutal honesty of Walsh's assessment crystallized the morning's catastrophe. Two state-of-the-art aircraft with highly trained crews were either destroyed or fighting for survival, victims of conditions that had been predicted by experts and ignored by commanders who mistook technology for invincibility. Major Brooks stood frozen beside the radio console, watching his career and his philosophy crumble simultaneously. The pilots he had championed, flying the aircraft he had proclaimed superior, were facing destruction because they had trusted equipment that failed when tested by forces beyond its design parameters. "Sir," Sergeant Patterson called from the meteorological station, his voice carrying the reluctance of someone delivering news that no one wanted to hear. The latest weather update shows conditions continuing to deteriorate. Peak wind speeds are now forecast to exceed 80 knots, with severe turbulence extending to ground level. The update meant that normal rescue operations were impossible. Conventional aircraft couldn't survive in conditions that had already claimed one Chinook and trapped another. The mountain valleys had become a death trap for any technology dependent on predictable environmental conditions. Colonel Martinez turned to survey the operations center, her gaze finally settling on Sarah, who had been monitoring the disaster with the grim satisfaction of someone whose warnings had been vindicated at terrible cost. "Mitchell," the colonel said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of command decisions that would haunt her regardless of their outcome. "How quickly can you get Charlie ready for an emergency launch?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to physics itself. Everyone understood what Martinez was asking, whether an aging aircraft and experienced crew could succeed where modern technology and confident pilots had failed catastrophically. Sarah looked at the weather displays showing conditions that exceeded the operational parameters of every aircraft on the base except one. Charlie had been built for a different era, when helicopters were expected to operate in adverse conditions without computer assistance, when pilot skill and mechanical reliability mattered more than technological sophistication. "Ma'am," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what was being requested, "Charlie's been ready since dawn. The question isn't whether we can launch, it's whether anyone should fly in conditions like this." The honesty was brutal but necessary. This wasn't about proving the superiority of older aircraft or vindication of traditional flying methods. This was about risking more lives to save lives that might already be lost, using equipment that might be marginally more capable of surviving conditions that had proven lethal to superior technology. Brooks looked at Sarah with desperation replacing his earlier arrogance. "Mitchell, can your aircraft reach them?" Sarah studied the weather displays and terrain maps with professional detachment, calculating odds that no sane pilot should accept. The mission was technically possible, but only if everything went perfectly, in conditions where nothing had gone perfectly for anyone else. "Sir, reaching them is possible. Getting everyone out alive is considerably less certain." The brutal mathematics of mountain rescue in extreme weather had reduced the morning's confident plans to a single, desperate gamble on whether experience could overcome conditions that had defeated technology. The failure was complete, and now the only hope lay with the aircraft and crew that had been dismissed as obsolete. The storm had spoken, and its verdict was written in twisted metal somewhere in the Colorado mountains. The silence in the operations center stretched for 15 seconds that felt like hours. Colonel Martinez stood beside the radio console, her hand hovering over the microphone as she wrestled with a decision that could end careers or save lives. Major Brooks stared at the weather displays showing conditions that had transformed familiar mountain terrain into an aerial graveyard. "Mitchell," Martinez said finally, her voice carrying the weight of command responsibility, "I need a straight answer. Can you reach our people?" Sarah walked to the tactical display showing the last known positions of both downed aircraft. The terrain was unforgiving, narrow valleys surrounded by peaks that created wind tunnels capable of destroying any aircraft that entered unprepared. But Charlie had flown in similar conditions before, in places where the mountains were higher and the margins for error even smaller. "Ma'am, the approach routes the computers calculated are suicide runs in current conditions. But there's an old mining road that follows the valley floor. If I stay low enough to use the terrain as wind protection, it's possible." Master Sergeant Kim moved to Sarah's shoulder, studying the same terrain features with the eye of someone who had learned to read landscapes like technical manuals. "The density altitude up there is going to rob us of power when we need it most. We'll be operating at the edge of performance capability." "Which is exactly where Charlie was designed to operate," Sarah replied. "The newer birds depend on computer-calculated safety margins. We've learned to work without margins when the mission requires it." Brooks stepped forward, his earlier arrogance replaced by desperate hope. "What do you need from us?" The question represented a complete reversal of the morning's power dynamics. The major who had dismissed Sarah's warnings was now asking for her expertise to save the pilots he had sent into conditions she had warned against. "Sir, I need complete operational authority over this mission. No interference from ground control, no second-guessing of tactical decisions. and no computer-generated flight paths. Charlie and I work best when we're not being managed by people who aren't in the aircraft. Martinez nodded immediately. Done. You have complete mission command. Sarah turned to Kim. Full emergency loadout, medical supplies, extraction equipment, and survival gear for extended operations. We may not get a second chance at this. As the two began their final preparations, Walsh's voice crackled through the radio speakers with increasing desperation. Operations, Alpha-led fuel state is approaching critical. I can't maintain controlled flight much longer in these conditions. The transmission added urgency to preparations that were already proceeding at maximum speed. Sarah ran through her pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision of someone who understood that overlooking any detail could prove fatal when operating beyond normal parameters. Charlie's engines coughed to life with the distinctive sound of machinery built for reliability rather than refinement. The twin rotors began their counter-rotating dance, creating the massive lifting force that had made the Chinook legendary for carrying impossible loads to unreachable places. Operations, this is Rescue 1 requesting immediate departure clearance. Martinez keyed her microphone without hesitation. Rescue 1, you are cleared for immediate departure. All other aircraft are ordered to remain clear of your operating area. Sarah lifted Charlie from the tarmac with the smooth confidence of someone who had learned to read aircraft behavior through thousands of hours of experience. The helicopter rose into air that was already showing signs of the turbulence that had claimed two modern aircraft. But instead of fighting the wind patterns, Sarah used them. She flew low, following terrain contours that provided natural wind breaks and avoiding the exposed ridges where automated flight systems had encountered forces beyond their programming. This was flying as art rather than science, dependent on intuition developed through years of reading atmospheric conditions that no computer could model. Operations, Rescue 1 entering the target area. Winds are severe but manageable using terrain-following techniques. The transmission brought the first hope the operations center had felt since the morning's disasters began. Sarah's calm professionalism stood in stark contrast to the panic that had characterized the earlier communications from the newer aircraft. Rescue 1, be advised Alpha 2's emergency beacon is still active but stationary. Alpha Lead's position is approximately 2 kilometers northeast of that location. Sarah processed the information while maneuvering Charlie through wind conditions that would have overwhelmed less experienced pilots. The key was reading the terrain and understanding how mountain topography affected airflow patterns. Where the newer pilots had tried to overpower the weather, she was working with it. Operations, I have visual contact with Alpha 2's crash site. The aircraft is down but appears intact. I can see movement around the wreckage. The confirmation that Chen's crew had survived brought audible relief through the radio speakers. But reaching them would require landing in a confined area during wind conditions that exceeded every safety guideline written for helicopter operations. Sarah began her approach with surgical precision, using techniques her father had taught her about reading wind patterns through visual cues that weren't captured by instruments. The crash site was located in a narrow valley where crosswinds could change direction and intensity within seconds. Rescue 1 beginning approach to Alpha 2 crash site. This is going to require manual flying beyond normal parameters. The landing was unlike anything taught in flight school. Sarah had to compensate for wind gusts that tried to slam Charlie into the valley walls while maintaining enough control authority to set down precisely in the small clearing where Chen's aircraft had come to rest. Every control input was a negotiation with forces trying to destroy her helicopter. But Charlie responded to her touch with the predictability of a machine built before computer assistance became standard. The older aircraft lacked sophisticated automation, but it also lacked sophisticated failure modes. When Sarah pulled collective pitch, the helicopter climbed. When she pushed cyclic forward, it moved forward. The relationship was direct and honest. The touchdown was harder than normal but controlled. Kim was out of the aircraft before the wheels had fully settled, running toward Chen's wreckage with medical supplies and extraction equipment. 4 casualties, 3 walking wounded, 1 serious, Kim reported over the intercom. Chen has a compound fracture of the left leg, but everyone is conscious and alert. Sarah kept the engines running at flight idle, ready for immediate departure. The wind was trying to push Charlie sideways across the rocky ground, requiring constant control inputs to maintain position. Load them up fast, she called to Kim. "We can't stay on the ground in these conditions." The evacuation proceeded with military efficiency driven by the understanding that their window for escape was measured in minutes rather than hours. Chen was loaded on a stretcher while his crew members helped each other into Charlie's cargo bay. Operations: Rescue 1 has recovered Alpha 2 crew. 4 souls on board, departing for Alpha Lead's position. The second phase of the mission would prove even more challenging. Walsh's aircraft was trapped in a valley system where the wind patterns created a natural trap for conventional helicopters. But Sarah had identified an approach route that used the terrain to break up the worst turbulence. Alpha Lead, Rescue 1 inbound to your position. What's your current status? Walsh's response came through speakers filled with static and the background noise of an aircraft being battered by forces beyond its design limits. Rescue 1, I'm down to emergency fuel reserves. Flight controls are barely responsive. I don't know how much longer I can keep this thing in the air. Sarah could hear the exhaustion and fear in Walsh's voice. He had been fighting for survival in conditions that had shattered his confidence in the technology he had trusted. Now he was learning what older pilots already knew, that when systems failed, success depended on fundamental flying skills in aircraft that responded predictably to pilot inputs. Alpha Lead, I need you to follow my lead to a landing site where we can extract your crew. Can you maintain formation flight? Negative, Rescue 1. Wind conditions are too severe for formation flying. I'm having trouble maintaining controlled flight at all. The admission meant that Sarah would have to guide Walsh to safety using radio instructions while flying her own aircraft through the same conditions that were overwhelming as more sophisticated helicopter. It was a test of piloting skill that went beyond normal training parameters. Alpha Lead, descend to valley floor level and follow the old mining road eastbound. Use the terrain to break up the wind patterns. Rescue 1, my flight computer is warning against low-level flight in these conditions. Sarah's response carried 20 years of mountain flying experience. Alpha Lead, turn off your flight computer. Trust your own judgment and fly the aircraft manually. The suggestion was radical for a pilot trained to depend on automated systems, but it was also the only way Walsh would survive conditions that had exceeded his technology's capabilities. He would have to learn in minutes what Sarah had spent decades perfecting, the art of reading weather and terrain through direct sensory input rather than computer interpretation. Rescue 1, I'm following your lead. Manual flight control engaged. The 2 Chinooks descended into the valley system together, one guided by computers and automation that were failing under stress, the other controlled by experience and intuition that had been tested in conditions far worse than anything Colorado could produce. Sarah was proving that sometimes the last resort was actually the best option that had been available all along. The valley that had become Walsh's prison stretched before Sarah like a wind tunnel designed by hostile forces. Crosswinds at 60 knots created downdrafts that could slam an aircraft into the rocky floor with lethal suddenness, while updrafts along the ridges promised false hope before delivering catastrophic turbulence. Walsh's Chinook appeared through the mountain haze like a wounded bird fighting against inevitable gravity. His aircraft lurched and bucked as automated systems struggled to interpret wind conditions that changed faster than computer processors could calculate responses. Sarah could see the newer helicopter's erratic flight path, the signature of a machine trying to follow programmed parameters in an environment that violated every assumption built into its software. Alpha Lead, I need you to stop fighting your flight computer and start fighting the weather, Sarah transmitted, her voice cutting through the static with calm authority. Disconnect the automated flight controls completely. Rescue 1, if I shut down the flight management system, I'll be flying manually in conditions that are beyond safe parameters. Sarah's response carried 2 decades of mountain flying wisdom. Alpha Lead, safe parameters stopped existing the moment you entered this valley. Your computer is trying to fly by rules that don't apply here. She could hear Walsh's internal struggle through the radio, the conflict between training that demanded trust in technology and reality that was proving technology inadequate. For pilots of his generation, manual flight in extreme conditions represented failure rather than necessity. Rescue 1, flight management system is off. I'm on manual controls. The change in Walsh's aircraft behavior was immediate and dramatic. Instead of the jerky, computerized responses that had characterized his earlier flying, the Chinook began moving with the fluid motions of a machine responding directly to pilot input. Walsh was learning in real time what Sarah had known for years, That direct control allowed adaptation to conditions that no programmer had anticipated. Alpha lead, follow my lead and match my altitude exactly. We're going to use the terrain to create our own wind shadow. Sarah guided both aircraft lower into the valley, using techniques that weren't taught in any flight school but had been passed down through generations of pilots who flew in places where computer assistance wasn't available. She read the wind patterns through visual cues, the way snow blew off ridges, how trees bent in gusts, the movement of debris that indicated air currents invisible to instruments. Rescue 1, this is incredible, Walsh's voice carried amazement replacing fear. My aircraft is responding like it never has before. I can actually feel what the wind is doing. The comment revealed the fundamental difference between modern and traditional flying methods. Walsh had been trained to trust instruments and computers to interpret conditions for him. Now he was learning to read the environment directly, using senses that no electronic system could replicate. Sarah spotted the landing zone she had identified during her approach, a small clearing protected by rock formations that would break up the worst wind patterns. It wasn't marked on any chart and wouldn't have been considered suitable by computer-assisted flight planning, but it offered the only realistic chance for extraction in current conditions. Alpha lead, I'm going to demonstrate the approach path. Watch my technique and duplicate it exactly. The landing approach required flying closer to the valley walls than any safety manual would recommend, using the rock formations to create natural wind breaks. Sarah's inputs were subtle and continuous, not the dramatic control movements that characterized emergency flying, but the smooth adjustments of someone who had learned to work with natural forces rather than fighting them. Charlie settled into the clearing with the solid thunk of a machine built for rough landings in impossible places. Sarah kept the engines at flight idle, while Walsh attempted his own approach, ready to provide guidance if his newly acquired manual flying skills proved insufficient. Alpha lead, you're coming in too high. Drop down another 50 feet and use the ridge line to block the crosswind. Walsh's approach was less smooth than Sarah's, but it demonstrated real piloting skill replacing technological dependence. His Chinook touched down hard but safely, the older pilot having learned in minutes what normally took years to master. Operations Rescue 1 has successfully extracted Alpha lead crew. Total recovery 8 souls from 2 aircraft, all personnel accounted for. The transmission brought audible celebration from the operations center, where Colonel Martinez and her staff had watched the impossible become routine through the skill of a pilot they had nearly sidelined. The return flight to Fort Carson provided Walsh with a masterclass in mountain weather flying that no simulator could replicate. Sarah guided both aircraft through wind conditions that had seemed insurmountable, using techniques that combined scientific understanding with intuitive feel for atmospheric behavior. Rescue 1, Walsh called during a brief calm period. I owe you an apology. Everything I thought I knew about flying was wrong. Sarah's response carried no triumph, only professional satisfaction. Alpha lead, you learned today what some of us learned years ago, that the best technology is worthless without the skill to use it properly. As Fort Carson came into view, both aircraft carried more than rescued personnel. They carried lessons about the relationship between human capability and mechanical reliability that would reshape how the entire squadron approached their profession. 3 weeks after the Mountain Thunder rescue, the atmosphere at Fort Carson had shifted in ways that couldn't be measured by organizational charts or efficiency reports. The debriefing sessions had been extensive and sometimes painful, but they had produced changes that went beyond policy adjustments to touch the fundamental culture of the aviation unit. Sarah sat in the same briefing room where Dr. Foster had delivered weather warnings that were ignored, but now the room was filled with pilots eager to learn techniques that couldn't be programmed into computers. The flying coffin had become required study material for every aviator on the base. The key to mountain weather flying, Sarah explained to the assembled pilots, isn't overpowering natural forces. It's understanding them well enough to work within their patterns. Captain Walsh, his arm still in a sling from the crash but his perspective permanently altered, raised his hand. Chief Mitchell, how do you develop that kind of intuitive feel for weather conditions? The question came from a pilot who had once dismissed such skills as outdated superstition. Now he understood that intuition was actually refined expertise, the result of processing thousands of small observations into actionable knowledge. Experience with aircraft that don't have computer backup systems, Sarah replied. When your life depends on reading conditions correctly, You develop senses that instruments can't replicate. Lieutenant Chen, recovered from his injuries but humbled by his experience, nodded thoughtfully. It's like learning a language instead of just following a translation program. The analogy was more accurate than Chen probably realized. Traditional flying required developing fluency in the language of atmospheric conditions, while computer-assisted flying often provided only literal translations that missed crucial nuances. Colonel Martinez entered the briefing room with several senior officers Sarah didn't recognize, visitors from higher command who had come to understand why an obsolete aircraft had succeeded where modern technology failed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Martinez announced, "I want to introduce General Patricia Hamilton from Army Aviation Command. The General has some announcements regarding future training protocols." General Hamilton stepped forward with the bearing of someone who had learned to value results over appearances. After reviewing the Mountain Thunder incident reports, Aviation Command has authorized several significant changes to training requirements and aircraft utilization policies. Sarah felt a mixture of anticipation and wariness. Military bureaucracies were notorious for drawing the wrong lessons from successful operations. First, all pilots will be required to complete mountain weather training using manual flight controls. Computer-assisted systems may be available as backup, but primary proficiency will be demonstrated through direct pilot control. The announcement drew murmurs of approval from the assembled pilots. They had all witnessed the consequences of overdependence on automated systems. Second, aircraft like Chief Mitchell's will be designated as specialized capability platforms rather than legacy equipment scheduled for retirement. Some missions require the unique characteristics of older, more robust aircraft. Sarah felt vindication that went beyond personal satisfaction. Charlie and aircraft like her would continue serving, because their capabilities had been proven rather than assumed. Finally, General Hamilton continued, Chief Mitchell has been selected for promotion to Major and assignment as Chief of Mountain Operations Training. Her expertise will be used to develop doctrine that combines traditional flying skills with appropriate use of modern technology. The promotion represented more than career advancement. It was institutional recognition that expertise developed through experience had value equal to formal education and technological familiarity. Major Brooks, who had requested transfer after the Mountain Thunder debacle, approached Sarah after the briefing. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by something approaching humility. Major Mitchell, I wanted to apologize personally. My prejudices nearly cost lives, and your skills saved them. Sarah accepted the apology with professional grace. Sir, we all learned something valuable. The key is making sure those lessons improve how we serve. As the weeks turned to months, the changes at Fort Carson rippled outward through the Army aviation community. Training programs were redesigned to emphasize fundamental flying skills alongside technological proficiency. Maintenance protocols were updated to preserve older aircraft whose unique capabilities had proven irreplaceable. Sarah found herself traveling to other bases, teaching courses that combined scientific meteorology with practical weather reading techniques. She demonstrated how pilots could develop the same intuitive understanding of atmospheric conditions that she had inherited from her father and refined through years of challenging flying. The flying coffin had become something unprecedented, proof that institutional wisdom could coexist with technological advancement when both were properly understood and appropriately applied. Charlie continued flying missions that tested her capabilities and validated her design philosophy. Each successful operation in challenging conditions reinforced the lesson that reliability often mattered more than sophistication when lives hung in the balance. The transformation was complete not when prejudices were overcome, but when expertise was recognized regardless of its source. Sarah had proven that sometimes the old ways weren't just adequate. They were essential for missions that pushed beyond the comfortable limits of modern assumptions. In the Colorado mountains, where weather and terrain had no respect for human pride or technological confidence, the test had been simple: what worked and what didn't. The answer had been written in metal and courage, measured in lives saved rather than systems operated. The flying coffin had become a symbol of resurrection, not just for the 40 souls it had carried to safety, but for the recognition that experience and technology could complement rather than compete with each other when properly balanced. Sometimes the most important victories weren't won against enemies, but against the assumptions that prevented people from recognizing capability that had been there all along. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.